This is Charter Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We're in the Inland Empire today, and we are joined by Stan Sniff. He is the sheriff of Riverside County. And I speak with you at a time when our nation is really in a state of mourning as it relates to the deaths of both civilians and officers in circumstances that break our hearts.
Right.
And I'm flummoxed to even be talking about this because Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter.
Absolutely.
And yet somehow those conversations have been turned upside down.
Yeah, I think we've lost the context of a lot what a lot of people attribute to a loss of unity in our community, a loss of cohesion for a variety of reasons. And I talk a lot with community groups, and we seem to be living, and it goes in cycles, but we seem to be living in an age of extremes and extremists and the overzealous. And it's not unusual to see these cycles in the United States, but it is really heartbreaking to see the damage and the toll it takes.
But what we've learned is if you look at the hard statistics, this is not the worst of times as it relates to officer deaths.
Yeah. In fact, to your point, when I first became a city police officer in the mid-'70s, that decade was so far the worst on record as far as officer deaths. But if you think about the context of that, all deaths, whether they're civilian or law enforcement officers, are very disturbing to all of us. And so the context that we all need to keep in mind is that things will change over time, and hopefully the dialogue and that unity thing that I mentioned comes back to the fore.
And I want to talk about that because I think we've discussed this before. After 9/11, the reservoir of goodwill for law enforcement was just, our cup runneth over.
Well, not just law enforcement. If you think about firefighters and also the U.S. Armed Forces. And yet we find ourselves, even though we're not talking about the armed forces, the reality is much of that has been a sea change since 9/11.
I want to talk to you about working as a police officer. On any given day, you could receive a call, one of your colleagues could receive a call, and you may not come home as a result of that call.
Right.
That doesn't happen for me.
Right. Well, and you got to remember too, within the context of those folks that have a sworn oath to go toward those dangers, as opposed to going the other way, where most normal citizens would end up going. So that duty and responsibility takes them directly on behalf of the public that they serve in harm's way. And many times, as you've seen in the national debate, enforcing laws that our public wants through its representatives, some of which many people view as government overreach. But if you remember the New York incident that was involved in enforcing loose cigarettes, the reality is we have a lot of government out there, and there's been a backlash, which is part of our DNA in the United States, against government. Law enforcement, 24/7, represents the very face of government at all different levels.
The flip side is there are young black men that will go out and they may not come home for a variety of reasons, but some are not coming home as a result of interactions with law enforcement. Pointing no fingers. I'm not there. I don't know. But you know, I can't. We hear about the talk where African American parents will talk to their African American sons. I don't have to have that talk. I mean, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, but in a larger context, we really all need to have that talk.
Yeah, you're right.
But the reality is we live in an era when personal accountability has been thrown by the wayside in many arenas. And if you look at the source of many of these conflicts with law enforcement officers, certainly all of them universally, and so there are larger issues at stake in that. But many of them dwell around failure to comply with lawful directions of the law enforcement officer, resisting arrest, running.
It is.
And so it's a different environment that we're dealing, a different generation, I suppose, that would be the easy way to say it.
How do we get to a place where young black men, young men, whomever, don't feel as if they have to run? Again, I'm not pointing fingers, but somehow they are afraid.
Well, I think that may be a nationwide viewpoint, but I think many are I know I've talked to you before, and and some of the other law enforcement leaders here locally have talked. I think in many of our agencies, none of them are perfect because they're made up of people dealing with people problems.
No one's perfect in any organization.
But the reality is many of us have made great strides on diversity, increasing education levels. Those discussions out there ongoing with the public, and nothing makes all these issues go away, but I think that does mitigate it. And I think to paint the brush with every law enforcement agency based on a few incidents across the United States, really complicated by the fact that the social media and the rest of it is near instantaneous.
Right.
There's an instantaneous rush to judgment instead of utilizing that normal term called due process.
And on top of that, a picture tells 1,000 words. A cell phone video may tell 10,000, but we don't know what happened before or after on both sides.
That's right.
On both sides. And so recently, the Democratic Convention was held, and we saw some mothers speak about the loss of their sons. Just from my point of view, it seemed as if they were speaking in a conciliatory tone. Did you get that? Did you feel as if there was that sense of conciliation?
And Brad, you are onto something. And the voices of the few, as you indicated, we really need to see that become the voice of the many. There are a lot of things that law enforcement officers have to do. The weapons and tools that they end up carrying, the very implements of their own death. And one of the things that I, as a law enforcement leader, have seen for quite some time now is a separation now between understanding what law enforcement has to do and how it does it under the law and the public's expectations shaped by social media and the video media. One of the things that we end up doing is every once in a while bringing in civilians. In fact, it would make a great show at one point to go into our simulators where some of these life and death decisions are made in a split second and how they're made. And usually, as I've seen community leaders go through that, and even people from the media, it changes their perspective about how difficult today a police officer or a deputy sheriff's job in making decisions. And all of us have all the tools on Monday and all the facts that are very, very different in those environments. And I'll underscore this, that no matter what goes on, law enforcement officers always have the fundamental right of self-defense. And that ends up being the core issue in many of these things that we've seen unfold before us. Sometimes those decisions have been bad. They end up being held accountable, and increasingly so due to the public outcry.
But yet what's interesting about that is how many jobs can result in a prison sentence for a mistake.
Exactly. And that is the great fear in law enforcement officers, being pushed by the public in their sworn oath to intervene in the human drama and human problems, and yet end up potentially losing their lives and their careers because of a mistake.
The flip side, though, there's a lot of discussion about access to guns.
Yes.
And that becomes very dicey because, look, the Second Amendment exists, but does the Second Amendment give someone the right to have an automatic weapon to use to hunt police officers like they did in Dallas?
Right.
And so it's got to be difficult for you. I know you're a supporter of the Second Amendment. I mean, most people are, but people see it different ways.
And that heightens a lot of the alertness that law enforcement officers and their training and what they have to do. And the environment that we operate now is laden with weapons, laden with a lot of volatility, as I indicated. There's a lot of very extreme views out there, and I hope we all get through this. But that unity issue, those smaller voices becoming larger voices as part of our dialogue in our communities, it's absolutely critical.
And I do feel as if those smaller voices are being heard loud and clear. And I do think there is a unity that is coming out of Dallas, coming out of Baton Rouge, out of San Diego. And again, we all matter.
Exactly.
We all matter. And I want to thank you for really digging deep and being willing to talk about this subject. It can't be easy. And we honor you, we honor your service, we honor the service of all officers, and we honor everyone. I mean, that's the reality. We're all Americans.
Thanks,
His name is Stan Sniff. He is the sheriff of Riverside County. My name is Brad Pomerance, Charter Local Edition.